We're going to move on to Galatians chapter 5, looking at verses 13 through 15. It reads this way, "For you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another." In 1985, Huey Lewis and the News released a hit song titled "Power of Love." The point of the song is that love is a powerful and yet often mysterious force that changes things. This song presents something that is true. However, historically, people have done many things based upon a love-driven ethic. Some we can perceive as good, and yet other things as evil. It is the source and subsequent quality of this love that is of paramount importance. Now, up to this point in the letter to the Galatians, Paul has primarily presented great arguments to defend the truth of the gospel against false teaching of the Judaizers. I know I must be sounding like a broken record, but we must remember that the Judaizers preached that a legalistic obedience to the law was essential for believers to be approved by God. This was contrary to the message of the gospel that one's approval before God was based solely on God's grace through faith in Jesus Christ and his finished work on the cross alone. This meant that believers were free rather than slaves to the law and its penalty. Yet the question that remained was this: how was the believer to live under such freedom? Wouldn't freedom lead to unruly and sinful living? Now, from this point on in the letter, Paul deals with how believers who are free will live victoriously over the flesh. He looks into the power of victorious Christian living and this power that will manifest itself in everyday life. Now, in these verses, Paul presented a contrast. He said, "For you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh." Believers are to walk in freedom, but not to use their freedom to indulge sinful desires. He goes on to present the first principle way that we should look at. He presented a new but old law, that is the law of love. Let me read to you the rest of the words that he wrote here. "Do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Now, this law of love was clearly presented in the Old Testament. It's seen in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18. So it's not new. However, it is new in its understanding and its source of power in the believer's life. And we can fully understand this law as we come to experience the love of Christ demonstrated by his sacrificial death on the cross. John wrote, "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers." Christ demonstrated what this love was about, like no other person in all of history. So what characterizes this love? The word translated love in these verses are agape, the highest and most noble form of love. And we see several aspects of this noble type of love in Jesus' crucifixion. First, it is voluntary. It is not given because some kind of external compulsion. Second, this love is sacrificial. It gives at a cost. Jesus paid the price. Third, it is given freely without ulterior motives. In other words, it's not what I'm going to get out of it. And fourth, similarly, it's given to benefit others and fulfill the purposes of God in them. It's really about, in general, when we give it properly, this love fulfills the purposes of God. So they have to align, the things we do have to align with God's will. Now, the love of which Paul wrote is not something that can be accomplished in the flesh. In fact, it's supernatural. It requires a higher power in the life of the believer. Paul will touch on this later in the letter, but for now, let us just think about this. It is the love of Christ within every believer, present by the indwelling presence of his Spirit. Every believer has the Holy Spirit and thus have the love of Christ indwelling them. The issue with which Paul will deal later in this letter is learning how to allow the Spirit to work in the believer's life rather than the flesh taking control. But if we're walking by the Spirit, if we're living under grace, one of the clear signs will be that this love that Jesus demonstrated on the cross will be being demonstrated by believers in Jesus Christ.